He sat at the edge of the parade, unnoticed by the crowd, just a quiet man with a cane and a faded USMC cap. A student volunteer spotted a forgotten name on a clipboard and looked up to see history sitting across the street. The loudspeaker called his name. A young Marine stepped forward. The crowd stood still as the old man slowly rose. After the parade, he didn't walk alone. The town that once passed him by now stopped to shake his hand. A year later, he led the parade and passed an empty chair marked for those still waiting to be seen. The parade for Veterans Day had turned the small town of Millstone into a sea of red, white, and blue. Flags waved from porches, children lined the sidewalks with painted cheeks, and brass bands echoed down the avenue. Fire trucks, veterans groups, marching high schoolers, everyone played their part in the patriotic celebration. But near the far end of the street, where the noise began to thin out and the crowds were sparse, one man sat alone in a folding chair. Mr. Leonard Hayes, 83, wore a simple gray coat and a baseball cap with faded gold stitching that read USMC, Vietnam Veteran. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his cane resting beside him in the grass. He wasn't waving a flag. He wasn't smiling for photos. He just watched, quietly, intently, as if searching for something only he could recognize. No one paid him much attention. A family with toddlers set up camp just a few feet away, laughing loudly and stepping around him without a glance. A girl chasing candy dropped from a float stumbled into his chair. Her mother apologized with a glance but kept walking. Mr. Hayes offered a small, polite smile, but his eyes never left the street. He had arrived early, before the barricades went up, finding a spot at the far edge where no one would ask him to move. He didn't come for recognition. He hadn't worn his medals or his uniform. In fact, he didn't even expect to be noticed. Across the street, a teenage volunteer named Caleb, manning a table for the event organizers, looked over at the man briefly, then went back to scrolling on his phone. Mr. Hayes shifted in his chair. Another float passed. Another round of applause filled the air. But still, no one called his name. Not yet. At the edge of the staging area, behind the grandstand, 19-year-old Caleb Ruiz was flipping through a worn clipboard, cross-checking the list of registered veterans. He wasn't part of the military, just a volunteer from the local community college, tasked with announcing honored guests as they passed through. The list was full of names, dates, and small handwritten notes. Army, Korea, Navy, Wubby-Witu, Purple Heart. But one name caught his eye. Scribbled in faded ink at the bottom of the page, almost forgotten beneath the last printed entry, were just two words: Leonard Hayes. Beside it, USMC, Vietnam, Silver Star. Caleb paused. He hadn't heard that name called earlier. Had they missed it? He looked around but didn't see anyone nearby matching the name or dressed in uniform. Curious, he typed the name into his phone. A single article came up from nearly a decade ago. Captain Leonard Hayes, rescued unit trapped in Da Nang Valley, 1969. The article described how he'd led a small team under enemy fire, carrying 2 wounded Marines on his back after a medevac failed to arrive. He'd been hit himself, refused evacuation, and coordinated a defensive perimeter that saved every man under his command. The final sentence read, "He disappeared from the public eye after returning home, rarely attending veteran events." Caleb's heart pounded. He scanned the crowd again, and this time saw him, alone, at the far end of the street. The old man with the weathered USMC hat, still, watching. Caleb grabbed the mic. "Hey, are we supposed to call out all the registered veterans?" he asked the sound technician. The man shrugged. Only the ones who checked in at the booth. But some of them, they don't want to be seen. Doesn't mean they don't deserve to be called, Caleb replied quietly. He turned back to the clipboard. No fanfare, no uniform. No one even knew he was there. But Caleb did now. He stepped to the microphone, his hand trembling slightly, and took a breath. Followed the parade without expression. He had seen such marches before, decades ago, after coming home to silence. Then, the music softened. The crowd shifted. A brief crackle from the loudspeakers interrupted the rhythm. A young voice, shaky, uncertain at first, rang out across the town square. Ladies and gentlemen, before our next group passes, we'd like to take a moment to honor someone very special watching from the sidelines today. People paused mid-sentence. Kids stopped grabbing candy. The cheer team fell still. Sitting on the east side of the street, near the veterans section, is Captain Leonard Hayes, a United States Marine, Vietnam War veteran, Silver Star recipient. Silence. Then, like a slow ripple in still water, heads turned. There, at the end of the block, sat the man no one had noticed. Just an old veteran in a gray coat and a sun-bleached hat. But now, every eye was on him. Leonard didn't move at first. His hand clutched the edge of his chair. His breathing quickened. For a moment he looked almost afraid. Then he heard it. Applause. Not polite, not routine, but real, sincere. It started with a few hands, then spread, down the street, across the lawn, into the windows of shops. People rose to their feet. Flags were raised higher. Phones came out, but they weren't filming a float. They were filming him. From the marching line, a group of young Marines broke formation. In full dress blues, boots polished, ribbons shining, they stepped out and approached Mr. Hayes. Leading them was a young sergeant, no older than 24. He walked up, saluted crisply, and said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Captain Hayes, sir, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, thank you for your service. Permission to escort you?" Leonard slowly stood. His knees trembled, but the sergeant offered a hand, not as a formality, but with true respect. The old Marine nodded, placing one hand on his cane, the other on the younger man's arm. Together, they began walking toward the street. The parade halted. Instead of passing him by, the procession waited. For him. A space cleared. One of the floats honked, then silenced its speakers. The mayor stepped out of her car and removed her hat. School children held their flags still. A small boy placed his hand over his heart. As Leonard stepped onto the road, one voice rang out from the crowd. "Welcome home, Captain!" He paused, just for a moment, then offered a slow, deliberate salute. The crowd answered with thunderous applause, and for the first time in over 50 years, Leonard Hayes didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen. The parade resumed eventually, but something had changed. The music returned. The floats rolled on. But the energy wasn't just festive anymore. It was reverent. Conversations turned into quiet reflections. Veterans in the crowd stood taller. And everywhere Leonard Hayes walked that day, people stepped aside not out of pity, but out of respect. After the final float passed and the street began to clear, Leonard tried to return to his chair, but he never made it back. A family invited him to lunch. A young mother pressed a handwritten note into his palm. A boy around 10 years old asked for a photo, then gave him a small flag he'd carried all day. That evening, photos of Leonard went viral on local social media pages. One post read, "He sat alone at the curb." Then they said his name. Within hours, hundreds of comments poured in. He was my dad's squad leader in '69. Saved him from a jungle ambush. I remember him working at the post office. I never knew he was a Silver Star recipient. Shame it took this long, but thank God someone said his name. At the VFW hall, which Leonard hadn't visited in years, someone printed a framed version of the viral post and placed it on the wall. The caption below it read, "Captain Leonard Hayes, not forgotten again." And the next week, something remarkable happened. Caleb, the student who found Leonard's name, started a campaign at the local college called Name the Quiet Ones. Its goal, to research and recognize overlooked veterans in the community, those who, like Leonard, never asked for thanks but deserved to be seen. Leonard was invited to speak at a civic banquet, but he declined the spotlight. Instead, he wrote a short note, which Caleb read aloud at the event. "I didn't come to be honored. I came to remember. But thanks to a voice and a microphone, you helped me feel remembered too." That means more than medals. 1 year later, the Veterans Day Parade returned to Millstone. This time, Leonard Hayes didn't sit alone at the end of the block. He rode in the lead vehicle, a vintage military jeep, polished and draped in flags. Seated beside him was Caleb, now a second-year history major, holding the same clipboard that started it all. As the jeep turned onto Main Street, Leonard raised his hand in a steady salute. The crowd responded with a roar of applause, louder and prouder than ever before. Children waved flags in rhythm. Teens who once scrolled through their phones now stood with hands over their hearts. Even old-timers, veterans themselves, stood shoulder to shoulder with young faces, honoring not just Leonard but all those like him. A banner unfurled across the grandstand. "Welcome home, Captain Hayes." He didn't speak much during the ride. He didn't need to. As the jeep passed the exact spot where he sat the year before, Leonard looked out and saw something that made him pause. A folding chair, empty but draped in a flag, with a handwritten sign taped to the back. "For those still waiting to be called." Leonard nodded once. His salute lingered longer this time. And though the music swelled and the parade marched on, a deeper rhythm had taken hold, a rhythm of remembrance, of voices rising for those who had waited in silence. Final message. Never underestimate the power of a name spoken with respect. Sometimes, all it takes is a voice to remind the world they were always heroes, long before we noticed.